We'll give our friends a moment to log in here. Really excited and looking forward to our conversation today. Welcome, I'm Dr. Jamie Matthias, Executive Director of the TLSBA, the Texas Latino School Boards Association. We currently find ourselves in the middle of a monograph and webinar series where we're trying to expose the real challenges of providing an equitable education to the students of Texas. 3 weeks ago, we discussed how it is that the HEB Excellence in Education finalist districts are doing. 2 weeks ago, we discussed the districts of the officers of TABSE and TABSE. Last week, we were on the districts of Tlsba and Tlsba. And lest anyone would think that we're carefully examining other districts, but not our own, we are excited and looking forward to next week when we put ourselves under the microscope and look at the performance of the districts that comprise the Board of Advisors of the Texas Latino School Boards Association, which are the top 20 Latino serving districts in the state of Texas. Today, however, we're excited to talk about the districts of the officers of TABSE and the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members. I want to brag for a moment on the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members because in 2020, we found ourselves in the middle of a pandemic, and the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members joined with MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association, when I was leading that organization, and together we presented a series of webinars that we published as Pandemic Public School Perspectives, the response of Texas education leaders to exacerbated inequities. That was a tremendous first step of collaboration between our organizations. Unfortunately, within weeks after the beginning of the pandemic, we found ourselves also confronting various issues of racial justice, beginning with the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members stepped up at that time and contributed their voices to this work, Seats at the Table, the school board members' perspectives on race and racism. So our friends at the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members have been tremendous, tremendous champions during this pandemic, during these past 2 years. So we're excited to be able to help share some data with them and also with our friends of the Texas Association of Black School Educators, TABSE. I regret that during my time with MASBA, we didn't have a closer relationship with our friends at TABSE, the Administrators Association, as we did with the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members. But we're hopeful that today's webinar will be able to share some insights into how it is that we might better provide an equitable education to all the students of our Texas public schools, with a particular interest today in the Latinx students who comprise the majority of our Texas public schools and of the African-American students in our Texas public schools as well. We just want to pause and welcome a great friend and champion for our Texas public schools, Mr. George Scott, former trustee of the Katy ISD Board of Trustees. Mr. Scott, how are we doing today?
Doing very well. And I want to maybe just respond to what you've just said for the last several minutes. It brings home the point that we're not out finding enemies among the people that we are focusing upon these school districts. Racism takes many forms. And one of them is when you hurt minority children in public education by not telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about how the state of Texas is avoiding, misrepresenting, escaping, running from, whatever phrase you want to use, from its genuine constitutional burden to children of color. And it's a sad tragedy. And you've just made the point so dramatically that when we point out the districts of the HEB award winners or TASA or TASB or the groups we are today, we constantly make the position that these groups and these school districts have been held hostage by the political power of a state of Texas that is highly motivated to not take care of at-risk children and disadvantaged children. So I'm glad you made that point. I'm glad you gave me a chance to do it again, because we're not out after enemies. We're out to tell the story of at-risk disadvantaged children who have been harmed for 30 years under the state of Texas non-leadership.
There you go. And as we make clear in the conclusion of today's monograph, which is found under the research tab of our TLSBA website, that's tlsba.org/research, you'll find today's monograph. What we are simply suggesting is that if we were to show the same urgency as a state that we showed both to the pandemic, remember how we as education leaders really stepped up and showed leadership in responding to that urgent need, and also the various issues of racial justice that appeared in 2020. Imagine if we were to focus the same intensity, give the same sense of urgency to this issue of the deception that's been perpetrated by the state of Texas. Mr. Scott, before we hand it off to you, I'll just show how it is that here on the screen we have our two organizations, the Texas Alliance of Black School Educators, TABSE, and the Texas Caucus of Black School Board Members, and the various districts that represent the districts of those two officer organizations. We're especially interested in seeing what it is we might be able to learn from the data of these districts.
Well, the data is going to be pretty much what it has been, because the state of Texas runs the state of Texas, and they've poisoned the whole pot.
Yeah.
You want me to kick into this?
Jump on in,
Okay.
Mr. Scott. Tell
The
us
thesis of what we have been
taught.
talking about for, this will be the 7th webinar, and we're going to add some new twists next week. You talk about not cutting yourself any slack. We're going to introduce some concepts next week that will tie all of it together, I believe. But we go back to the start, and that is that the state of Texas has had the audacity to establish a system of accountability from the get-go that has said children do not have to be performing at grade level for us to get a gold star for meeting our equity burden to disadvantaged at-risk children. And what this table just shows this, we're not talking about TABSE, we're not talking about tax, we don't have to digging up bones left better undug, or whatever that country song is. Today, right now under STAR, the state of Texas defines its burden of constitutional equity as allowing disadvantaged at-risk children to be performing below grade level, but still get credit for them passing the test. And you've made comment on this, even the green with the yellow down the line, even the standards of grade level in too many instances are very, very suspect. Proof of the old adage, you can stick a syringe of cobra venom in your arm, or you can stick that syringe of cobra venom in your foot, and you're going to spoil the body. Okay. And so once you start compromising with the lives of at-risk disadvantaged children, you are affecting every child in that system. And that's what we have. And that's what our focus is.
For those who may be joining us for the first time, we just want to draw your attention to the third row, which has 4 key words: fail, approach, meets, and masters. So what happens is in its reporting, as I understand it, and we'll look to Mr. Scott to correct me here, but I understand that the state of Texas has those who failed the test in one category, but then those who approach and those who meet and those who master are all lumped together as a sign for the state of Texas to say those who didn't fail the test are meeting our constitutional burden of providing an equitable education, even though they are not at grade level, which is the green category here.
Right.
And so in the graphs that, in the bar charts that follow, what is the green here will be shown in white, those who are at grade level. Those who fail will be shown in black, that'll be another number. But then we've done a bit of math here to separate out those that are approaching, that we put in gray, where they are approaching grade level, means they're not at grade level. They're passed on from one grade level to the next, even though they lack the necessary knowledge and skills for subsequent levels.
That says it just exactly right.
So, Mr. George, Mr. Scott, before we go on to the next slide, could you just help us to understand the percentages that we're seeing under the approach column? We've said it in past webinars, but for those who are joining us for the first time, Are we correct in reading, for instance, that in 6th grade math, a student can correctly answer 36.8% of the questions on the 6th grade math test and pass the star?
That's what it means. And by that same token, that same 6th grader in math can get 60.5% of the questions right and be at grade level. You notice that the meets grade level, I highlighted the really suspect ones in yellow. Remember, there are 40 questions, 38 questions. You see the number of questions on the test. And so this is getting really into the weeds. We've done it before, but I'll just make a reference. The state of Texas can manipulate the results by by playing games with 3 questions on the test. Okay, it field test every question. It knows how students did in a field test. It can put when a question was field tested, 50% of the kids got it right. There's been parallel questions in subsequent years, and they put that harder question on the test in 2018 or 2019, and shazam, more kids are getting it because it's a classic teach to the test familiarity. So even the grade level standard is suspect.
So, Mr. Scott, you provide examples of that in your book, The Lies of Texas. Is there one quick one, for instance, in math that you might be able to provide to give us an idea for our listeners, what those questions might look like that are repeated from grade to grade?
Math is the easiest. It's the easiest to do. So I'll go back years ago when I had left the Commissioner's Accountability Advisory Committee. I used to be respected in this group. I used to be able to break bread and walk the walk with them. But I left when I discovered how dishonest and corrupt the system really was. I put in my resignation, and I asked to go back and interview the intelligentsia of the TEA. And this included test administrators. They actually brought in test contractors in. And it's been 20 years or so, something like that. There were 15, 16 people in the room. And I guess they were expecting me to open up with in the weeds. And I asked a real basic question, but it's exactly symbolic to the question you've just asked me. Steve goes into a restaurant with a $20 bill. He spends $6.85. How much change should Steve get? Not one of them would answer this question. When do you want your child or grandchild to be able to answer that question? What grade level? And no one, several $1 million worth of salaries around that table, the accumulated expertise of the testing movement, and not one person would ask that question. And it's a very simple question. It's a very simple question and a very simple reason. The $20 bill question, as I call it during the TABSE era, was on a 5th grade, on a 6th grade, on a 7th grade, on an 8th grade, and on a 10th grade test. It's an elementary school question that was put on a 10th grade exit test that was used in part to help calibrate college readiness. The state of Texas has been misrepresenting the truth for 30 years. And all we're asking, Dr. Matthias, is to find those folks who really want to take this system on and put a stop to this nonsense, put a stop to it by taking the actions necessary that our educators, that our school districts know that when you've got a kid in 7th grade who has 4th and 5th grade math skills, it is disastrous to that child's educational future to be gauging how he or she does on a 7th grade math test. That's the reason for the diminished standards. That's the reason that the scores have been cut so low post-TABSE, is they had to have a lower standard to give children a better chance of passing. And even with those lower standards, there are thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and cumulative millions of children over this time who are not performing at grade level.
My word. So we just keep lowering the bar, it seems.
We've lowered the bar.
So we're seeing some pretty high percentages in this table, Mr. Scott. Can you tell us what we're seeing here? We recognize the TABSE and Texas Caucus of Black School Board member officer districts on the left-hand side in the left column. What are all these high percentages?
All right, we ask a very basic question. We spent about the last 6 or 7 minutes talking about below grade level. That's what we've talked about, how it's calculated, how it's incorporated. This table shows in English 1, in A-Leaf ISD as an example, that 67% of the kids who took the English 1 test in A-Leaf were, I'm sorry, I got my eyes out of focus. I apologize.
No worries.
71% of the students who took the English 1 test were Latinx in A-Leaf. Okay, that's what that shows. And it shows that the percent of students who performed below grade level. That's the calculus that we're doing.
There you go.
So 71% of the Latinx, 55% of the Asian, 63% of the African American, 61% of the white, 68% of the economic disadvantage, 71% of the at-risk, and 96% of the retesters were performing below grade level. I apologize for getting my eyesight off there for a moment.
We were ready to help you out there, but what we're understanding is these are very high percentages of students who are found to be below grade level in English 1 at the top and in English 2 at the bottom.
Correct.
Retesters especially is especially sobering, because the retesters are those who, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Scott, are taking the test for more than the first time. It could be their second or third time taking this test.
That's exactly right. And let's just put it in terms that are a little tough. Those retesters don't need the Hubble telescope to see dropping out. We know, because of our public information request, and I keep saying we want to get some money and have that analyzed completely one day. We know that 99,000 students plus who were enrolled in the 9th grade in 2015-16 were not enrolled in Texas public education 4 years later in their chronological senior year. And we know that some people move out of state, some go homeschooling, some do this. But the bottom line is there are tens and tens of thousands of students every year. And you can rest assured that a lot of them were retesters, a lot of them were at risk, and a lot of them were economically disadvantaged. But the state does not give a truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth of those leavers. You can see 19 to 20% in some districts. 23, 25% of the students taking English 1 are taking it for the second or third time or more.
Incredible.
Same in English 2.
Yikes. And all of this then affects post-secondary studies, college success. And so, Mr. Scott, we've seen this in previous webinars, but for those who are joining us for the first time, tell us what we're looking at between the ECO-DIS, the economically disadvantaged students at the top, and the non-economically disadvantaged students at the bottom.
All right, what you're looking at is a report that's produced by the Higher Education Coordinating Board. And they produce several reports on college graduation. This report in particular does track, to the degree possible, out-of-state enrollment, and it uses a national clearinghouse to supplement the information that it has from its own data for students that enrolled in Texas. And what you're seeing is that economic disadvantaged students were 45.2% of the graduates in the class of 10-11. 62% were ever enrolled in a higher education. What's that mean? Significant percentages of economically disadvantaged are knocking on the door and walking through some college or university. The next column is never found. That number adds up to 100%. But look at this one, the ever enrolled, no degree, no certificate. Of the economically disadvantaged students in the state of Texas who ever enrolled in higher education, they could not find a degree or even a certificate in 42.8% of them. And of those economically disadvantaged, 6.2% were found to have earned a 2-year degree, and 12% were found to have earned a 4-year degree. Look at the difference in 4-year degrees between economically disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged students. It is significant, it is profound, and it makes one wonder about the asserted success passing rates, grade level rates, and mastery rates on end of course testing in the state of Texas. Something doesn't add up. That adds up.
Yeah, for those who are looking at this table and thinking, well, this is some old data, we just want to explain that these are the students who, within the industry standard of 6 years, who earned or did not earn a post-secondary degree or certificate. So we tend to pick on the ones that are first in line alphabetically. I'll just look down at Spring ISD, for instance. Spring ISD, we see at the top that 72.2% of the students in the Spring ISD's class of 2011 enrolled in higher ed. Yay, that's exciting. Or even above that, I see Marlin ISD, 76.1% of the graduates of the class of 2011 in Marlin ISD, 76.1%. That's more than 3/4 enrolled in higher ed. Yay for us. But then when we follow across and add up the percentages for earning 2-year degrees and earning 4-year degrees, to see that only 10.9% of students earned a degree, knowing that 76.1% went into post-secondary studies, that is telling. What I'm understanding, we have some 65% of the students of that graduating class who went off to college and who left college after 6 years, they still had not earned a degree or certificate.
Well, and you may, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, in Spring ISD, similarly, 72.2% of the students enrolled in higher ed. Yay for us. We pat ourselves on the back when we see such numbers. But then when we see that only, when you follow the line across, add 2-year and 4-year, 18.8% of students received a degree within 6 years. That's something that we need to be paying attention to as trustees and education leaders. Mr. Scott?
Yes, and you made 2 points there. One, we have had some discussion, not with you and I, but there have been some inquiries. Well, that's 2011. Let's do some simple math. 11, 12, 12, 13, 13, 14, 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17. This carries that class through 16, 17. It is also the last year that the Higher Education Coordinating Board has produced this table. It's the last class. I have a feeling we would have another one up there if the pandemic had not hit, but this is the most recent. But we understood that when we created this table. So we've done other things. We have looked at more current GPA. And what you see is there is no sea change in the graduating classes of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 17, 18. We've got GPA tables. We're going to do something next week that this table inspired, but we're going to break it out on the group that is closest to the Texas Latino School Boards Association. And it is college preparation indicators, SAT scores. If there were a sea change in this one, we wouldn't see the SAT scores of the graduating class of 17, 18 that we're going to see. If there had been a sea change in this, we wouldn't see the significant percentage of students that are taking a higher education coordinating board imposed test on graduates of Texas public schools to say, here, we want you to take a test to see if you're really college ready. Okay. And when you look at the results of that test, you see that the preponderance, I'm talking about significant percentages, 60 and 70% at some of these districts do not meet the criterion on this test that the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board imposes before students actually get to enroll in college or university. And you've made this point, I think, in every webinar, so I'm going to throw it back to you for you to expand on it. These are kids that are, a lot of these children are assuming college debt. They're going to remediation. They fail the TSI, we'll get to, but they go to college. They have to do remediation because they don't have the skills. They get college debt to pay for that. Even if they're not doing remediation, they're getting college debt. And the dropout rates are staggering. And you've talked about that in several of our webinars.
And what absolutely breaks my heart, Mr. Scott, is that we're seeing on the screen numbers, but these numbers represent real kids and real lives and real families. When I look at the Houston ISD, before I point out Marlin ISD and Spring ISD, well, granted, Marlin ISD may not be the largest district in the state, but the Houston ISD is. When we're talking about 60% of the students of the graduating class of 2011 in the Houston ISD enrolling in higher education, that is tremendous. That is a tremendous number. But when we see that only 17% of them earned a degree within 6 years, that is heartbreaking.
Well, the economic disadvantage you're talking about.
Of the economically disadvantaged students, there you go.
That's right. Go to Kashmir, go to Wheatley, go to any of the classic inner city traditional schools and take a look underneath HISD. It's tragic. It is a human tragedy. And our mission in life has become trying to find that source that will help us find a true path to help these children once and for all get over this nonsense.
Amen. Well said, Mr. Scott. So now we're starting to see how it is this data starts to look in the districts of the officers of TABSE, the Texas Association of Black School Educators, and the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members. We know that the TEA lumps together the white and the gray to report larger percentages of students who are passing the star. But when we become more critical, when we place the scores under a microscope and start looking more carefully, the gray represents the students who, yes, pass the star, but are still below grade level. Only those areas of the bars that are in white are the students who who are at or above grade level in 6th grade reading. Mr. Scott, what are you seeing here?
Same thing you just described. We've talked a lot about the tables, and your Carlos created gray for a whole new purpose. He's disaggregated those tables. The state of Texas, here is a real tragedy. The state of Texas profits by that gray. Tell me the profit that a child who is below grade level earns because the state of Texas profits on below grade level. The state of Texas gets to assert a higher passing rate, but the children in gray, it's sad.
Here we see large percentages in some districts, a third of students who are passing the star, even though they are found below grade level.
That's it. And there
Here we
you
have
go.
6th grade math. We put this beside the chart that we saw previously because we know that black, those that are now color-coded in black on this chart to the right, are those who got less than 36.8% of the questions right. So in order to be white or gray on this bar chart, you need to get at least 36.8% of the questions right. Tell us what you see when you see this bar chart, Mr. Scott.
I see the same thing that we've described and enunciated for 7 weeks now. And we're going to try to do some really interesting stuff in our final web of this series. I see the state of Texas having almost at will power to misrepresent its burden to children to serve its interest. And I see a big question mark. And that big question mark is the same question mark that we've been asking. If these children can't turn to their leaders, to whom can they turn? It is time for all of us that value public education to put aside our petty differences, our regional differences. I'm a conservative Republican who has a hard time voting Republican anymore. I can sit down with liberal Democrats. I can sit down with liberal Democrats and I can say, this has got to stop. We can't let the ethnicity differences between us, the religious differences between us, even some of the political differences between us. This is not about Republican or Democrat. This is not about conservative or liberal. This is about a state government that has spent 30 years harming at-risk, disadvantaged children by not telling the truth. And conservative Republicans shouldn't support that. Liberal Democrats should not acquiesce to it. There has to be a common bond between us that says once and for all, can we just stop the TEA from being able to do this carte blanche at will? Have we grown so comfortable with their imposed deception that we don't think it can be stopped? I'm convinced it can be. I really have believed for 25 years that it can be, or I wouldn't be doing this webinar with you today. 30 years, sorry.
Yeah, what this bar chart also makes me think of is the unwillingness of the state of Texas to adequately fund our public schools. When I see a school district like Marlin and compare, I hate to pick on any school district here, but just for the sake of numbers, and you start comparing these to the numbers on the left-hand side, when we see the various thresholds, we know that just over a quarter of the students in the Marlin ISD before the pandemic were able to correctly answer 60.5% of the questions correct on this test. But then how it is that there are 42% of the students in the Marlin ISD, 42% of the students in 6th grade were not able to correctly answer 36% of the questions correctly on this test. We need to find a way to get these districts the resources they need to get students to grade level.
You and I have heard this. You've just raised an incredible point, and what you have just done is say something that a lot of people in education do not want to say. And there was something you said last week that prompted what I'm about to say again. Some people want to do away with this test. Well, you're just talking about a test. Children's lives are bigger than a single test. We shouldn't put so much emphasis on a single test. And there's some truth to that. If all you live for is a test, which is pretty much what the state of Texas has imposed now by neutering the standards. But here's the deal. Here's the real deal. It's not the test. It is what the test has produced. It has produced an artificial burden that requires substandard standards to get kids over an artificial hurdle. And the analogy that I used last week was this test is the best evidence of the TEA's institutional racism. This may be the first time I have actually said that in 30 years in public. This test is the best evidence of the state's institutional racism. Don't be like those in 1968 forward with the Richard Nixon presidency, who in 1972 said, just burn the Watergate tapes. Let's just destroy the Watergate tapes. You didn't send him into Watergate. The Watergate tapes proved that he was a federal criminal. These tests prove that the state of Texas has misrepresented academic grade level, harmed minority children, and now is not the time to destroy the test. You may need new testing metrics. It's going to take 3 to 5 years to even get on a course to start doing something that the state of Texas has failed to do for 30 years. And that is put a test that children and school districts can use to get them to grade level, honest grade level, that can use to meet their academic needs, that can use to close the academic achievement gap. So I know, because I've had these conversations with before, when I heard what you said, there's people out there saying, well, they're just putting too much emphasis on the test. No, we are not. Grammar is grammar, math is math, reading is reading, comprehension is comprehension. And students that get to the 12th grade, get a diploma and go to college and drop out have not been served by this dishonest system.
How do we equip them with the necessary knowledge and skills, I would say? So, Mr. Scott, you speak of institutional racism. That's what I'm seeing in this bar chart. So now we're beginning to disaggregate the data by race or ethnicity. We start seeing in every set of bars here for each school district, we see 4 bars. The first bar being for Asian students, the second bar being for white students, the third bar for Hispanic or Latinx students, the fourth bar for African-American students. And this is where we start seeing real gaps in performance. Mr. Scott?
It's as clear as this graph. It's as clear as any table we've ever produced. Children, generally speaking, I have to step back because this is dangerous territory for me, so I have to step back. What these tables and what everything that we have done over the last 7 weeks proves is that academic performance doesn't have one darn thing to do with ethnicity. We have shown that students of all ethnicity, students of all economic demographic profiles are doing excellent. They're scoring high on SAT, ACT. They're going to college. They're getting the 2-year degree. They're getting the 4-year degree. And our data proves that it doesn't have a darn thing to do with ethnicity. But what the data also shows is that the TEA needs Asians and white students to bring the averages up because of the compromises they have made to pretend that they're meeting the needs of at-risk disadvantaged students. Now, that's a very dangerous thing for someone like me and someone that's been in the arena to say. I hope I said it right. What this table shows is that the state of Texas doesn't give a rat's tail about economic disadvantaged children. That's what it shows. And it shows that students that have more opportunity, which are generally those that are not economically disadvantaged, which generally includes students who are not disadvantaged, at-risk children of minority, that the gaps are huge. Yeah. Okay, that's what it shows. And I hope I was careful enough. And I hope if I get slack, if I get some incoming, you'll defend me on that one.
There we go. We'll take a few arrows. For me, this is a social justice issue.
Social justice all the way.
A racial justice issue. After the death of George Floyd, my husband and I, we went down to the Texas Capitol and we rallied with all our friends for racial justice. We need to have the same energy behind this chart. When we look at the Houston ISD to see the gap between Asian and white students with Latinx or Hispanic students and African-American students, there is no reason for us to have gaps that wide. The Houston ISD, Klein ISD, Lamar Consolidated ISD, even Northside ISD, the differences that we're seeing between children of color and children of pallor, the term that some of us prefer to use for white students, is just, it's appalling.
No, and let's emphasize the point here. We're talking about that gray area, that below grade level, and that passing area. The last 8 or 10 or 15 minutes of this particular webinar may have been our very best, may have been our most on point. The state of Texas needs, for its own institutional legal protection, it needs to lie about its success for disadvantaged children statistically dominated by children of color. And people of pallor, that's a new one for me, people of pallor need to be as outraged as anyone else.
Well said. Here we see, take a look at-risk students. We know that we classify various students with various labels for the sake of accountability at the state and federal levels. We use labels like economically disadvantaged or at risk. In this bar chart, we see in 2 columns, 2 bars for every school district. The first is for not at-risk students. And you can see how it is that we might pat ourselves on the back, especially for the way in which we are, for the much lower percentages of not at-risk students who are outright failing the test, but then we add the gray bars, and then we look at the at-risk students, and we see that we are not doing so well at serving at-risk students. We may be serving a bit better those who are a bit easier to educate, but when it comes to the at-risk students in our Texas public schools, some of these numbers are sobering. To see 9 or 10% or 11% of at-risk students being at grade level in this subject. 6th grade reading. Mr. Scott?
Well, this again, when you divide it out as we've chosen to do it, chosen to focus on at-risk and eco particularly, when you look at it, it just says the dominant statistic of at-risk and economically disadvantaged are children of color. And there's no coincidence between the state's misrepresentation and that graph. That says it all.
Here we see English 1. So that was 6th grade reading that we just looked at. But if we were to fast forward to the very end of a student's career, the very last end of course exam that's required in the state of Texas is English 2.
Well, no, there's others. There's U.S. history. We're just not reporting on those. But
there we go.
To me, English 1 and English 2 are the single most relevant for analysis. We're going to do some analysis next week that would affect history, algebra, biology. But we're stopping at English 2 because this is where the dropouts begin.
There you go. And I apologize, I'm seeing that the table on the right is not the correct table for this, so we're just going to skip by this slide.
I'm glad you made a mistake. I made one, so you can too.
There we go. This is an interesting graph now of trend lines. What Carlos has tried to do is to help us to see how well are we doing at closing gaps. That is to say, when a gap exists in the 3rd grade, are we seeing that gap start to close as the students go through our Texas public schools, or are we seeing the gaps start to widen? What we see here in all 9 districts of the officers of the Texas Association of Black School Educators and the Texas Caucus of Black School Members is that the gaps continue to grow from one year to the next. There's not a single trend line that goes downward that shows the gap closing. Instead, what we see here are gaps that are widening from one year to the next.
Let me add that one of the reasons to kind of stop this analysis at English 1 and English 2 is we know a lot of dropouts in the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th grades, those 3 other tests. And so this one really is sort of the magic threshold to kind of take a look at this kind of a data analysis and even more.
Wow. Carlos has helped us with a similar chart for math through the years to see if we are closing gaps. And we just want to give a special shout out here to the Northside ISD. As we can see here, the Northside ISD is the closest one to being level. The trend line is that the gap with which it started, which is a significant gap, some 40 points between at-risk and not at-risk students, is maintained, whereas in all other districts of the officers of TABSE and the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members, we see the gaps widening. Mr. Scott, as we look at these numbers, I'm afraid for us to turn the microscope on ourselves next week. I'm a little nervous.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about next week?
Sure.
Or do you want to stay focused on this?
Actually, I think that we only have 2 more slides left on this
Okay.
one. So we'll finish this up and then we'll leave with whetting the appetites of those who've joined us. What we see here for those who are with us is, let's see, for every district, we see 3 bars that represent all students of a district, then non-economically disadvantaged students of the district, and then economically disadvantaged students of the district. What strikes us here are the large gray, dark gray bars in each one of these. The dark gray bars we see as the key indicates below is the percentage of students who enrolled in higher education, but who 6 years later had no degree or certificate to show from it. That's a lot of students. Those are high percentage of students who enrolled in higher education and who left presumably with debt and certainly with no degree or certificate. Mr. Scott?
Yes, I mean, you cannot have the misdirection, the malfeasant deception in K through 12, or more importantly, in this kind of sense, 9 through 12, high school, and then see these kinds of dropout rates, these kinds of attendance rates for which there is nothing found, or the dropout, or the low GPAs. In the past, we've reported on the GPAs. It's not unusual for, let's just make up a number. I mean, the data is the data. We have it in the tables. Let's say that 25 or 28% of a district's student body will enroll in a 2-year college. It's not uncommon for 40 or 50% to be having a GPA of below 2.5 in the first year, you know? And then when you triangulate that with the economic disadvantage graduation rates, and when you look at some data we're going to unveil next week, it all is the picture. The TEA can produce billions of numbers, billions of graphics, hundreds of press conferences over time. They can tout everything, but they cannot erase the downstream impact of when the kids leave the TEA's jurisdiction. And that's where the rubber hits the road and the TEA's handiwork in the lives of children begins paying the worst dividends.
Yeah. And finally, our last slide as part of this presentation, simply in this slide, we ask ourselves, how well are we preparing our students for post-secondary success? For every district, we show two sets of bar charts. The first one is for the numbers of students from each high school who do not enroll in higher education, who are not found in higher education, those who go to colleges and universities out of state, and those who roll in or to private institutions. And then those in light green go to 2-year Texas public colleges, and dark green, Texas 4-year public universities. In the second set for each high school, we show 2 bars. The first one is 4-year colleges on the top, and the second bar, the one on the bottom, is 2-year schools. What's interesting to note is the large number of students who are pushed into 2-year colleges, especially, who end up failing out of college. We see the grade point average after a single semester of college. This was pre-pandemic, so this is the last data that is available before the pandemic. So we can only imagine what those data will look like during and after this pandemic.
I want to just nuance, because you said it right, but I want to make sure I want to nuance it.
Go for it.
This is the table. Remember when we were looking at eco disadvantage graduation weights? That's the one that uses the National Clearinghouse and captures students out of state.
Okay. This
is the one that the Higher Ed Board produces.
Okay.
This is the one that just includes in-state enrollment. So the not found could include students that enroll out of state.
Okay.
But we've got it covered both ways. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just striking when we look in terms of the actual numbers, for instance, in the Lancaster ISD, which is the higher set of bar charts here, to see that when we're talking about concrete lives of concrete students and their families, some 90 students enrolled in 2-year public colleges in Texas who were effectively failing out, who had received less than a 2.0 during their
2.5.
Less than 2.5 would be orange, would be adding the orange as well.
So that's okay. I apologize.
No worries, no worries. So if we were to say less than a 2.5, we'd add the orange section as well. That would be it looks like some 114 students who from that class was earning less than a 2.5 or less than a 2.0, some 90 students, those in red. So these numbers are absolutely, we really appreciate, Mr. Scott, your willingness to make these public information requests of the TEA, or in this case of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, for us to be able to really dig into data. For those who want to read more, this monograph is available under the research tab of our website. That's tlsba.org/research. Mr. Scott, I think we're on the edges of our seat for you to whet our appetite for what's coming up next week.
Well, next week, we're going to have 20 school districts are going to be included. It's what we're now calling our top 20 that are very close to the Latino School Board Association. And it's really important because it involves the largest school districts in the state of Texas: Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, El Paso, big metropolitan areas. It has big Latinx districts: Isleta, Brownsville, Brownsville, Beaumont, Pasadena. It has suburban districts. I was a tad surprised. Not surprised about the enrollment. I know Katy very well, but I was a little bit surprised that Katy worked its way into the top 20
Number
of
20.
the organization. When I moved to Katy in 1983, it was a solid white school district. African Americans were second. Hispanics were a distant third, kind of like Houston ISD long ago. Now, Latinx students in Katy ISD are the single largest student component. And so you've got suburban wealthy districts, you have large inner city districts, you have suburban districts that are maybe not as well off financially as Katy. We've got 20 school districts that represent a significant portion of the state enrollment. We're going to have a table that shows you every district that we've done so far and how relevant that is to the state of Texas. You know, it's not a Florida exit poll. Some may not remember that, but we're doing something that is significant, cumulative, and very important. We're going to add 3 things. The eco disadvantage alone and the GPA alone don't tell as much of the story as we've wanted to tell on the college readiness. But there's 3 reports that we're going back in and dug out to do, and that is percent of students taking the TSIA test. Well, what's the TSIA test? It is a test that the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board imposes on certain graduates of the state of Texas if they want to enroll in community college or college. Wonder why? We'll talk about that. We look at the 11th and 12th grade participation and meeting criterion in advanced placement or international baccalaureate courses. And you say, well, what's AP and AB got to do with equity? A whole lot, because we're looking at it by the ethnic and economically disadvantaged profiles. And you're going to see something here is if the passing rates and the mastery rates, particularly in some of these ELC scores, are so great, why is the criterion performance in AP and IB so low, and why is there such dramatic disparity? Then we're going to look at the SAT scores, and we're going to show you something that the state of Texas has in asterisks, but we're going to show it to you. If everything, if what is true, the passing rates on the end of course, the college-ready assertions that the state of Texas likes to assert, or is it the SAT scores and those percent of students who are performing at criterion on the SAT or ACT? All right. And what you're going to see is a dramatic disparity between the ethnicities and the demographic profiles. And we're going to say one little discovery you're going to get for next week. So we're adding three major components of analysis for the top 20 that are near and dear to the Texas Latino School Board Association. I think we're going to close out in very good style. And then we're going to have to find out, Dr. Matthias, if the rubber's ever going to hit the road, if we're going to find some support. And we're going to take a break, as I understand the schedule. And we're going to really focus on trying to extrapolate what will then be the last 8 weeks of our lives into trying to find some support to take it to the next level. And if we take it to the next level, this is just a down payment. The next level, if we can get there, is going to be the superstructure of what we've been doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Scott. And we also want to thank all who joined us today for this webinar, the 7th in our series of 8 webinars. We simply want to leave with the conclusion in today's monograph was the way that we rallied ourselves as trustees and education leaders to respond to the pandemic, and the way that we rallied to respond to racial injustices in 2020 both served as models for how we might rally around this issue, which is no less an issue of racial justice and social justice here in our Texas public schools. Again, you can find this monograph at our TLSBA website, tlsba.org/research. Mr. Scott, thank you for joining us today. I'm nervous about next week when we turn the microscope on ourselves. We'll be examining the top 20 Latino serving districts in the state of Texas. We know that here in the TLSBA, our Board of Advisors is comprised of the representatives of the top 20 Latino serving districts and also of our 20 education service centers here in Texas. So looking forward to turning the microscope on ourselves. Final word, Mr. Scott, we'll give you the final word.
Oh, I've said enough words today. I got to say some words for next week.
Looking forward to next week then. Thank you all for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.